Now let's look at the basic ways in which we can select and manipulate objects in Maya. To do this, we're going to create a couple of polygons. So let's go to Create, Polygon Primitives, and let's start with a sphere. So we know that if we want to select a sphere, we can just click on it or draw a marquee window around it and it'll get selected. Let's create a second object. So this time, let's create a cube. You can't see the cube because by default, Maya will always create objects in the 0, 0 location. So that means the cube is actually inside the sphere right now. We can see this if we go to wireframe mode. So remember, if we go up here and click on the wireframe option, we can see now that the cube is inside of the sphere. To select the cube and move it away from the sphere, we can either go into our outliner on the left side, and this is where we can select by object, or we can just zoom in and select the cube. Once we have the cube selected, I will show you a new hotkey. So if you hit W on your keyboard, it'll activate the move function. This can also be accessed on your left side tab here, this middle button. Once we have the move tool activated, we can see here that we have options to click and drag and move it in the Z direction, or we can click and drag and move it in the Y plane or on the Z plane. If we just hover over these different squares, this means that we can freely move it around in these different planes, right? So we can move it around on the Z plane or the Y plane. I like to use these arrows because it's a more precise way of locating your object. So now that we've moved the cube, let's zoom out, go back to your shaded mode, and now let's create a third polygon. So let's go to Create, Polygon Primitives, and this time let's create a cylinder. The cylinder will be moved now to the side of the sphere. So now that we have these three objects, I want you to see the different modes of selecting them. If we want to select multiple objects, we can either shift and click, or if we want to unselect an object, we can hit Control key and click on the objects we want to unselect. This is one way. The other way is again dragging a window and it'll select whatever objects are touching that window. And then the third way of selecting was here on your outliner menu, and you can also hit Shift to select multiple objects, Control to unselect, or select single objects. If you have a lot of objects in your scene, the outliner is a really useful way to be able to control and select objects. Now let's see the next function, which is rotate. If we hit the hotkey that is E on our keyboard, it'll automatically switch from moving to rotating. And if I select each object, you can see that now my icon has switched from the moving to the rotating. If I select the red, it'll rotate my object on the x-axis. If I select the blue, it'll rotate it along the z-axis. And if I select the green, I'll be able to rotate my object along the y-axis. If I select freely, not touching either the red, green, or the blue, I can freely rotate my object around. Again, I like to have more control, so I really like to guide myself along these guides because this means that it's really rotating along a defined axis. So another hotkey that I want to show you now is A. What A does is it zooms all of the objects in your scene. So we knew that if we select an object and hit F, it'll frame your selection, frame whatever you're selecting. But if you hit A, it's going to frame all of the objects in your scene. Let's look at the third tool, which is Scale. So the Scale tool is a hotkey that is R. So if you hit R, you'll see now we've switched from rotating to scale. This is this button on your left side. When we scale an object, we can scale it in all different directions in X, Y, Z and scale uniformly, or we can select one axis along to scale. This is going to deform your geometry. So again, if I want to scale my cube in all axes, I'll grab the yellow button in the center. If I want to stretch my cube along one axis, I can select either the X, Y, or Z axis and scale it along that. These are the basic tools that will allow you to modify your geometries. So again, it's move, scale, and rotate. And the hotkeys for this are W to move, E to rotate, and R to scale. W, E, R. Now let's take a look at ways to duplicate objects and also manipulate pivot points. So let's delete everything we have in our scene by selecting it and hitting delete key. And let's start again with some simple geometry. So let's go to create, polygon primitives, and let's create a cube. Now, if I wanted to duplicate my cube, I can hit Control D, and if you look at the outliner, I've created a second cube, and it's located in the same space as the first cube, so that's why you can only see one cube here. But if we hit the hotkey W to get the move tool and then move it along, we'll see the second cube now. Let's try and hit the Shift D. What happened now? I got a third cube, but this time instead of having it appear on my 0, 0 location, it's actually kind of copied the last transformation that I did when I duplicated my first cube, and then that's how it's found the location for the third cube. So if I hit Shift D again and again, we'll see that Maya kind of remembers the first transformation you did after duplicating your first object, and that's our duplicate special function. Let's try hitting Control D. So I hit Control D, and now my cube is located on top of my last cube. So we have Control D, which duplicates the object in the same location where the original one is. And we have Shift D, which copies the last transformation. So now we have a series of cubes in our scene. And I want you to see different ways of switching the pivot point around, right? So this is my pivot point, this main square. And by default, you can see that the pivot point is located in the center of your geometry. And what happens if we move the pivot point? So if we hit D and click drag our mouse, you can see that we can move the pivot point of our geometry. If I let go of my mouse and then let go of the D function, I've moved now my pivot point to a different location. So this means that, for example, if we want to rotate, hitting E, our cube, it's going to rotate it now from this other location. So not from the center of the cube, but actually from the bottom of it. Let's try changing the pivot point for this second cube. So let's hit D again, but this time, while we keep D on the keyboard, let's also hit V. Let's drag our pivot point, and you're gonna see that now what it does is that it snaps it onto the edge. So this function is a more controlled way to kind of locate our pivot point to a useful part in our geometry. If I want to have it in this corner, I can let go of my mouse and now let go of B and D, and I've switched my pivot point to the bottom left corner of my cube. So if I rotate it around now, so now let's say I want to move this cube on top of the previous cube. What can I do is I go back to W, which is my move tool, right? And the way that we know how to move now is using these arrows. But what if I wanted more precision and I wanted to have my top cube actually touch a vertex from the bottom cube? Since my pivot point is located in this vertex, I already have control of that. But how can I snap it to this other point in this bottom cube? So let's hit V and now drag, and you're going to see that now V means vertices. So what it's doing is it's snapping it to any vertex that it finds. So let's try practicing these two functions of D and V, and let's also try and assembling an abstract kind of tower with all these other cubes. So I'm going to hit the next one. I want to first kind of rotate it, so I'm going to keep it on this center axis. Hit E and rotate my cube around. And now that it's rotated, I want to, again, move my pivot point now to this vertex. So again, I hit D. And since I want to snap it to a specific point, I also need to hit V. And now that this has switched to a circle icon, I can click and drag and let go of my mouse once I have it in the right vertex. So now that it's in the right vertex, I want to have this corner of my cube go to this top corner of this previous cube. So again, I hit V in order to move and snap it along a vertex. Let's try a next cube. And this time, let's try moving this pivot point to this center part. So what I can do is hit D and V to snap it along a vertex. And now that it's there, I can let go, but what we want it is to have it actually in the center of this axis, right? So if we want to move it here, now that we have it along this plane, all we have to do is hit V. All we have to do is hit D and move the point towards the center and then let it go again. So let's rotate it now from this pivot point. So let's hit E to rotate and rotate it around. So this is the last cube that I'll try to assemble, right? And I want to have maybe this bottom corner in the front move to this corner. So again, let's go back to W to move our cube. hit V, and then snap it along that vertice. So now we have a physically impossible vertical structure. What if we wanted to have multiple of these structures? What we could do is select all of them and again hit Control D, and this duplicates them on the same spot and we can move them around. If we hit Shift D, we got duplicate special, which copies and moves them to the next point. So if we've just looked at the duplicate function and then the pivot point, moving around the pivot point and being able to snap it along a vertice.